You are listening to the ERP, Organizational Change Journal, a podcast brought to you by Nestle and Associates.
One thing I do want to ask is, and this was on your website, and I'm going to share a quote with our listeners, but you said, my mission is to bring a science-based approach to culture, wellness, sustainability, the future of work, and leadership to make practical the finest academic ideas so that business leaders can deploy those rather than dated ideas or worse, myths, you've mentioned.
I do use that word, yes.
But do me a favor, if you would, define for our listeners science-based approach and then tell me what its value is.
Well, you know, it's funny, the very first model, so I wanted to become a change guy in the 1990s, right? I was disenchanted with the strategy world. We weren't making a difference I wanted to make in the world. I wanted to be on the field scoring goals rather than the guys shouting on the sidelines. So that's why I became a change guy. And the very first course I took was PricewaterhouseCoopers Change Management Practitioner course. And the very first model they put up on the screen is a model that you'll have seen from a woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, called Denial, Anger, Bargaining, Depression, Acceptance, the so-called change curve. I think all your listeners will be familiar with that. Is it one that resonates with you? Have you heard of that model?
I have. Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. So that model, the change curve, would imply that the researcher in the 60s did this research on people who were dying. And the idea that I was taught in my very first change course was that change mirrored that experience. First you'd have denial, and then you'd bargain, and then you'd anger. And there was this dip into depression, and then finally you'd accept it. And why that's a myth is, first of all, anybody listening will think, why should change be like dying again, to remind me? But yet that's orthodoxy, you know, until a year ago, that was the logo that was on the website of the Organizational Change Practitioners Forum on LinkedIn. And so that is not based in science, although, I mean, she did some research, but to take the science that she did on the experience of someone dying and saying, oh, by the way, the new workday system will affect people in the same way is, I think, patently absurd. So the book I'm having, I don't want to turn this into a promotional thing. I've got a book coming out in a few weeks called Change Myths that goes through 5 or 6 of the most pervasive myths, of which that's the first one. So when I say science-backed, what I mean to say is that, you know, it's been evaluated by evidence, that you can actually back it up with science. And not a lot of stuff that we do in change is that robust. You know, it's more like a craft. It's more to me like carpentry, and more to me like making use of models.
It's a bit of an art.
Yeah, exactly. Made up in the 80s and 90s. You know, there's stuff around like ADKAR, for example, that was from John Cotter's model. There's a model from a guy called Kurt Levine called Unfreeze, Change, Refreeze. And, you know, these things are at the core of orthodox change management. Let's take that last one, that 3-step unfreeze, change, refreeze. That model has been around since the 1940s. Well, does it apply to modern organizations? Like, can you say modern organizations are frozen? Are they?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're in a different world where actually organizations are constant change. It's not just that organizations are these static things, and then somebody decides that they're going to make some change happening all the time. So this model of organizations is frozen. And then from the idea that they're frozen, you have to unfreeze them. And the language you use for that is burning platform, for example, or create a sense of urgency from the famous John Cotter 8 steps. And so that is another thing, because those at their heart you need to instill a sense of almost fear in people. You use some kind of emotional activation, not like inspiration, not that kind of activation, but kind of a fear-based kind of. Burning platform was, you know, to people who were trained not to jump off an oil rig, found that was the only way to save their life, was to jump off the oil rig, you know, because the platform was burning. It's kind of macabre. But so when I say that, I say like a lot of the stuff on which we founded the change management, organizational change profession, to me, just seemed to not make sense. That's the epiphany.
That's great. I appreciate that. And so let me maybe peel that onion back just a little bit further. Yeah. And I don't want to paraphrase for a reason. So allow me to provide our listeners with a couple more quotes just so I can drive home my question.
Yes.
And one thing is you say change mythology. The change world is populated by gurus where popularity is a proxy for expertise. But many change ideas, learning styles, 7-20-10, MBTI, sense of urgency, have been challenged by science. What should we discard? What do we replace those ideas with? And Paul, you also share that, quote, your goal is to extend business research beyond trivial concepts and fads, especially business leadership,
Yeah.
and to go around it in a serious empirical and theoretical work from outside traditional business schools and business consulting. And just to add another quote, and quote, to do that, we need a sound scientific understanding of people, but most of the ideas used to lead people are based on fads, myths, pseudoscience, and unproven management models. The 21st century research provides us with some new ideas to replace the old in areas such as behavioral economics, new organization structures, the psychology of risk, complexity theory, social complexity, and neuroscience. I love that, Paul. That's why I wanted to share that quote. And so in your book, and then here's my question. In your book, you discuss defenders of faith, how to prove something works, right? How to prove something works in this world out there where there's so much stuff and ideas. So how then do you, Paul, how do organizations know that a consultant's practice is founded in science-based approach? So you already told me what science-based approach is. You told me the value. Well, then how do, as organizations and leaders, how do they know? They don't spend as much time as maybe Paul or Jack and get so engaged in the leadership theories and that sort of thing. So how do organizations know what they can really count on?
Well, here's a simple thing, right? I mean, there's something that everybody in the world has done, which is MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, right?
Yeah.
Everybody. That again, that's something else that's based on the work of a mother-daughter pair. About 100 years ago, the mom started becoming passionate about personality typing. She developed her own personality type. And then she discovered this guy called Carl Jung, and Carl Jung had his other personality type. And from Jung's personality type, we have this MBTI. Now, the question with MBTI is like, is it based in science? And the answer is no. Jung was more of a mystic than a scientist. And he sort of pulled those four things out of his, extensive experience as a psychotherapist. But if you look into Jung's four categories, they're not at all validated by science. Now, there are ones that are. So there's something called the Big Five. Which ones survive? Well, only one of Jung's categories survives into the Big Five, and that's the one that's the difference between introversion and extroversion. The other three of them you can cast out. And so there are scientific alternatives. Now, the Big Five has been validated by neuroscience and fMRI research. It was derived using statistical methods. And the Big Five is just one example of a shift. The other one that was really interesting to me when I was writing my book, The Science of Organizational Change, I bought this book on chance because it had a great title, which was called The 50 Myths of Popular Psychology. And, I bought it because I was curious, right? And this was a very robust book written by a guy who's unfortunately just passed away from Emory University called Scott Lilienfeld. And of those 50 myths, I had a master's in psychology and been training as an applied psychologist and working in applied psychology and business for, 20 years when I read this book. And I read this book and I think I believed like 30 of them. and so it was an epiphany for me. It was like, oh, dude. Now, so, okay, what's an example of that? So one of the ones is learning styles, right? So there's this idea. You'll get really interested in this. So there's an idea that there's a thing called learning styles. And if you hear even the woman who worked in the Trump administration, what was her name? The Secretary of Education. She's from Michigan, like you.
DeVos.
DeVos. Yes, that's right. The DeVos family. Yeah. And she said, I want to make sure every student in this country has curricula that are tailored to their learning styles. I read this book and I thought, holy thing. So here's the thing about learning styles. It's trivially true that we have preferences. Some people prefer video, some people prefer audio, some people prefer the written word, some people prefer what's called kinesthetic learning. It's trivially true that we have preferences. Now, the question is, can you extrapolate from people have preferences to if you teach someone in accord with their learning style? This is called the matching hypothesis. So you match the way the material is presented in the classroom or in the workplace to someone's learning style. Do they learn faster? And so you can study that, right? You can, look at people's learning styles. They can take the learning styles inventory questionnaire, right? And then you can give them learning experiences, different modalities, and say, how well do these people learn, right? So you can test that with science, right? And the truth of the matter is people don't learn faster or better when you teach them content that's aligned with their learning style. That's a fascinating thing. And it's super counterintuitive because you would think like, oh, I like video better, so obviously I'll learn better if I watch videos. Well, it's just not the case. And that's a fascinating thing because our entire educational system, 93% of teachers believe in and use learning styles in the classroom.
Yeah.
So that was a fascinating thing to me. And here's the other thing that I was illuminated by, the guy who wrote this book, because I had to get him on my podcast, Scott Lilienfeld. I had to talk to him. I said, but what's the harm in that? So my student may not learn faster if he's watching a video or an auditory listener or whatever method we're delivering the content to him. And he may not learn faster, but he likes it better. Isn't that better? And he said, here's the thing. If you're a soccer player and you're coaching a young, really talented 10-year-old soccer player, and this guy's super good with his right foot, and he really, really prefers his right foot, are you doing him a service by saying, okay, use your right foot? Mm-hmm. No, because to become a well-rounded player, he needs to do what's really uncomfortable for him and learn to use that left foot. And so he not only said that learning styles, that matching hypothesis was wrong, but he actually said that it's harmful. And that's an interesting thing to me, too, because in today's world, right? In today's world, you need to be a multimedia learner. You need to be able to gather the nectar from where it is, from its inside books, it's in YouTube videos, it's on LinkedIn posts. You need to be this kind of all-rounded learner, because learning is the meta skill for the 21st century. That's, pretty important compared to many other things, the skills that we need in organization. It's the most important meta skill, I would say, is being a great learner. And so you need to learn in a multimodal thing. So are they serving my 10-year-old child by saying, oh, you're an auditory listener or you're a visual learner, and just providing them with content in that modality? And the answer is, it looks like, no, you're doing them a great disservice, like the soccer player who prefers to use his right foot. So I think, these are interesting things that, science is teaching us that are orthodoxy in the teaching profession, and they're orthodoxy, among the change community too, because change community is always talking about, like, how do I tailor training to people's learning styles? So that's a rather long, I hope that's an interesting story too.
That is great. That illustration is fantastic. And I will say, I love this. You and I could talk about this particular topic for a couple of hours. One of the things you may or may not have noticed, we have a lot of L&D professionals on our podcast here, and learning and development. And we do that for a reason, so that we can talk about these ideas that you're talking about in effective and efficient education. Because, for me, in the context of what Nestle and Associates does, we're an ERP organizational change firm. That's what we do. And so guess what? A part of that is significant learning. It's significant development of the organization's people. And also, guess what? A lot of the principles that you're talking about here that might apply through K through 12 apply to adult learners as well. You can't minimize it. And in fact, I think that, and I've studied hundreds and hundreds of project plans, formally and informally, and the tactical piece and Paul, back to what you were just talking about with your epiphany, in your introduction, this idea of taking strategy and ideas and putting it into action. Well, first of all, your strategy's got to be sound, but then making it most effective in practice, again, is a whole new story. And I think that very idea and that epiphany certainly applies to large-scale organizational change as well. But anyways.
Well, I think you find in your practice that one of the things that we talk about a lot about is engagement. And one of the things that I think is true that you've almost certainly found is we engage too few people too late.
Yeah, right.
So, get people involved and inspired and aware, involve them in some of the decision-making process appropriately. Of course, earlier in the process, I think that's one of the things that's kind of one of my mantras from the change practice.
Yeah, absolutely.